just over the years, I said, geez, I really like that story. I'd like to do something with it. And I'd been a novelist, before I was a filmmaker. And one day I just said, I bet I could I felt like I was squeezing a lot of history into a 2-hour movie, and I felt like, well, if I write a novel, it could expand a little. And, between, just the opportunity to expand it and the fact that the Screenwriters Guild, which is the Hollywood Union for screenwriters, went on something like an 8-month strike. The book expanded to 1,000 pages. And I'd say the one thing that was fun about, I rarely, my previous novel, Los Gusanos, was also written during a screenwriter strike, 15 years earlier. First of all, it's great to just get to work on one thing. As a screenwriter for hire, I'm often working on 2 or 3 things in different, stages. I might be doing the treatment for one and polish for another and writing the main thing on something. So it was nice to just be able to work on that one thing. And the one thing that I was actually very, very disciplined about, and some of you I'm sure have written historical or tried to write historical fiction, was I kept myself to the discipline of I could only do 1 week of research, and then I had to sit down and write some fiction. So I would, research something for a chapter and then say, well, I may have to come back to this. This is all very fascinating, but now I have to sit down and write the chapter. And yeah, there will be some blanks that I have to fill in later with more research, but at least research is just so seductive, and it's like a great, mansion with all these great hallways you could go down, and you can wake up and it's 3 years later and you're still in the library. And, and my book, starts in the Yukon and ends up on Coney Island, 5 years later. And so I did go down some of those corridors, but I never get lost, because I would always come back and sit down and write a chapter. When I first started writing for the movies, back in the late 70s, I did that, and people would say, so who do you think should play this character? And I would always say, well, Spencer Tracy. And he was already dead. And quite honestly, I try not to, because even if it's a friend of yours, the actor, they may not be available, they may not be interested. And then it becomes hard because you've got that person in your head. When I'm a writer for hire, and they think they know who they want it to be, I wrote a movie called The Howling, a horror movie years ago, and the director came to me and said, if you expand this character a little bit, or give him a speech, I think we could get Slim Pickens, to play this. And I said, okay, and I wrote, I took a bunch of his things and put them together on 2 pages, and I wrote like a 2-page, Slim Pickens soliloquy, and apparently he came to the set and he said, boys, this dialogue fits me like a glove. So not when I'm making my own stuff, but for other people sometimes I'm literally told who's going to play with it. And then you have an idea, well, what does this person do well? When they made the movie of The Old Gringo, originally it was going to be Burt Lancaster, and unfortunately he'd had a heart attack and the insurance company wouldn't pass on him to allow him to do it. And they got Gregory Peck, who was fine, but a lot of the people who worked on the movie were always like, it would have been so much better with Burt Lancaster. Whereas the general audience didn't know that, and so they totally accepted the Gregory Peck version, which was very different. Yeah, one of the biggest differences in the writing process, for me, is that when you're writing a movie, especially a feature, you have this relationship to time. Movies are going to be, from 90 to 120, 130 minutes. And so much of what the writing is about structure and when you release information to the audience. When do you release, kind of plot information? When do you release emotional information? And, keeping the audience wanting to know what happens next. Obviously, in a 1,000-page book, there's a very different rhythm. People are going to put it down. They may put it down for a week and come back for it. And I know a lot of people watch movies at home and they may stop the video in the middle and freeze frame and come back to it. But finally, it's still made to live in time in a very different way than a novel is. And then for me also the other difference is the one that we're talking about, which is that you have in a movie all these collaborators. When I write a book, it can be, on about half of my books I've had an editor and they've been helpful at the very last stages of it. But basically it's what you can make it, but also you have God's powers. You are a God. If you want the sun to shine, you say it was a sunny day, and I once did the Bay of Pigs invasion in 6 pages, and I had tanks and planes and everything, If I had done that as a screenplay and I was going to direct it, being a low-budget filmmaker, I knew the first question I'd hear from the costume person is, are we going to see their feet? Because I need 5,000 pairs of boots, and can the front row be leather and everything else leatherette, and then we'll just paint the feet of the people in the back rows because we can't afford all those boots. So in a movie, at the best, you're an enlightened despot or something like that. You have a lot of control, but if the sun doesn't want to shine, it's not going to shine. On the other hand, you've got production designer, costumer, composer, actors, all of whom can have skills that you don't have, and all of who will bring you ideas that are basically really storytelling ideas, and you get to pick the best one, or the one you like the most, but you don't have to come up with the idea. So there are pros and cons to both of them, but they're very, very different processes. And for me, the most important one is that relationship to time and rhythm of how do you release information.
So right now, television is such high quality. Are you at all thinking miniseries with this book? Because it definitely couldn't be a film.
Oh, I don't have the luxury of thinking that. Somebody has to think of it for me, and then I would consider.
I just thought of it.
I'm writing. Yeah, I'm writing right now. I've written a treatment that's gonna, if they want to do it, a series about the Budweiser Bush family from St. Louis. I'm writing a treatment set for a 3-part miniseries set during the Civil War. There's another one during the Civil Rights industry that we're, era that I'm, a lot of what actually writers do now is act. I mean, you're probably running into this, which is that people come to you with an idea. We'd love to make a miniseries, or we'd like to make a feature for this, and would you like to do it? And then it takes a while, and they say, okay, you've got the job. Now go sell it for us. So you go around, and I do 45 to an hour show where I pitch it on Skype or in the room or whatever, and I may do that to, I've done it as many 9 times in a couple weeks to all the various places, and then they say whether they're going to make it or not. Now that's, for me, that's about 2/3 of the work of writing the script, and I haven't necessarily put anything on paper. I certainly haven't put anything on paper. And I also get a lot of things where, we're thinking of making a movie out of Iron Man. What's your take on it? And we're going out to some other people. And so what you know is that you're one of maybe 8 or 9 people, and they're going to listen to everybody's idea of how they would make it, but they don't have to pay you unless you write something down on paper and hand it to them. So you do your hour of how you would do it, and they may have already hired another writer. And so they're just writing notes down, and I've literally run into a writer who said, well, I got your notes. And I said, what do you mean I got your notes? Well, when they were asking you if you wanted to rewrite this project I wrote, well, they told me, they kept telling me this, and I said, oh, well, and John Sayles says you should do it that way, I said, well, I thought I was up for the job, and I wasn't up for the job. I was just, a public information officer or something. I always liken it to being a football player who carries the ball, but never necessarily makes the touchdown. So your contribution might be, well, you made some first downs and you moved the ball further down the field, but then you're not the guy they give the ball to when they get close to the end zone. And I quite honestly, in the last 15 years, I've taken my name off more movie projects than I've asked to have it kept on. And I've written on so many movies that I never get credit on, where I'm just one of the guys who, during the process, carried the ball for a while.